So there is another story that I want to talk about this week, and this one was one that I was actually kind of surprised to hear. Now, I'm sure that a lot of people, I know that there are a lot of people who follow this podcast who I imagine are very enthusiastic about Disney and everything that Disney does. Everything that Disney produces, and right now there's so much of it. Like, they've become such a huge just IP giant. I mean, okay, obviously there's the traditional Disney stuff, and then there's all of the Marvel stuff. There's all the Fox stuff, like The Simpsons, and there's Star Wars. I'm going to circle back to that in a minute. But one little story kind of crossed my attention this week that I was a little bit alarmed about, and it turns out that as the COVID pandemic has been ramping up, numbers have been increasing in different places in the States. One of the things that has naturally affected has been the theme park industry. Now, the theme park industry, that's a way bigger industry in the States than it is here in Canada. If you're in a place like California, it's pretty big and it employs a lot of people. And so what that means is that as those people are slowly put out of work by this COVID-19 pandemic, it means that there are a lot of people out there that are suffering. Now, one thing that Disney had apparently been doing to help some of their workers that they've either had to lay off entirely or they've had to furlough was that they were running something that they were calling the Disney Pantry. And basically what the Disney Pantry was, it was a food bank that was specifically for the Disney employees who were losing their jobs over this pandemic. And that was obviously a great thing for Disney to be doing. Now, I think that maybe this perception has changed quite a bit in recent years, and recent events are not going to help that at all. But one thing that has been talked about at different points in the past was that, Disney was a major corporation that was running itself like it was a family business. And this was actually something that they had kind of tagged into some of their corporate culture marketing. They used to talk about the quote-unquote, Disney difference. That when you work for Disney, you're not just an employee, you're a part of the family. It's a family business and you're part of this family and we're going to look after you. Now, there have been a lot of big changes at Disney over the last several years, including changes in management. And as it turns out, it looks like maybe that corporate culture is now a thing in the past, and now their newer corporate culture is something that is a lot more conventional, a lot uglier, a lot of the things that people don't like about corporate entities. So the specific story that I'm talking about is Disney has basically come out and said that it looks like they might need to close the Disney Pantry. And they might be leaving a lot of those employees without that kind of support. And so basically, they might be leaving their furloughed and laid off employees basically to starve. But I would like to draw your attention back to the air quotes around the word need. And they're saying that they might need to shut down the Disney Pantry. Because it turns out that one thing that's going on right now is that even while all of these workers are being laid off, Disney's executives, they're drawing bonuses in the amount of like tens of millions of dollars. In particular, the chief financial officer of the company just recently this month drew a $12 million bonus. And that's actually being paid out despite of all the financial difficulties that the company is having. Maybe on one hand you could say to themselves, well, the financial difficulties, they're on account of the pandemic. You can't blame the CFO for the pandemic. Okay, and fair enough in a certain sense, that is true. But I think that there's something that's just a little bit more to it than that. Because you can go back to this statement where they kind of set it up as they need to shut down this Disney Pantry. Well, no, actually they don't need to do that. That's something that they're choosing to do. There is money available for them to fund that thing. As a matter of fact, I can think of $12 million. I can think of no less than $12 million that is immediately available for them to fund this program. But instead, as many corporate executives have been wont to do, particularly you've seen this in recent years, but they're not choosing to look after their employees, they're choosing to look after themselves. And you can actually see that in the detail that they're just flat out laying off a bunch of these employees instead of trying to keep them around. I mean, a Disney executive, yeah, they deserve to be paid for their work, but they are not by any means what you would call a poor person. They're very independently wealthy. Now, if somebody had to make a sacrifice for the good of that company, there's somebody who can afford to do it. Somebody who's maybe earning, minimum wage to, to maybe be a waiter in a restaurant at a Disney resort. They can't afford to make that sacrifice, and they're not choosing to make that sacrifice. The person who's taking home a multi-million-dollar salary and then a $12 million bonus on top of that, they're amongst the people who are making that decision. They're making that decision for them, that they're going to make that sacrifice, instead of making that sacrifice themselves. And this is something that I've actually taken issue with. I find myself taking issue with it more and more and more over recent years. The more that I see people kind of come along and manage to get themselves into control of things that other people built. They come along and they're the new hire to manage a particular business or a particular, say, sports franchise, or in this case, Disney. They're a recent arrival and they didn't actually build this thing. But then once they're in control of it, the first thing that they do, the first thing that they seem to do is they look to take care of themselves. They don't look after all of the people who built the thing from the ground up. The people who put in work over years and years and years. Like blood, sweat, and tears over, in some cases, decades. To build this thing up, they kind of view this thing as their stepping stone into something else, their resume item. Something that's going to get them along the line to some other goal that they have for themselves, and they take care of themselves first. And they take care of themselves, they take care of their own agenda first. Now, I'm going to relate that back to Star Wars now at this point by talking about another story related to Star Wars that came out this week. Now, it's just as a quick aside, The Mandalorian has probably been the best thing to happen to Star Wars, and actually probably the best thing to happen to Star Wars fans in probably about a decade. Like, no question, hands down, this is some of the best Star Wars that we have ever seen. As a matter of fact, what we're seeing with The Mandalorian is probably far more what like fans wanted the sequel trilogy, episodes 7, 8, and 9, to be with than what we actually got with those three movies. I think that each of those three movies, there was a lot to be said for them. I have a lot of criticisms about that, and maybe someday I'll do another segment of another podcast just related to my criticisms of those movies. I'm not going to talk about that right here. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is a story about the Mandalorian. And this one relates back to The Last Jedi, which a lot of people found to be, an extremely disappointing Star Wars movie. I know that I was disappointed with it in a lot of ways. But a story came out this week where the producer of The Mandalorian, a guy by the name of Dave Filoni, he talked about Rian Johnson and said that Rian Johnson had been very helpful in helping him transition from animation into working with live action. And a lot of fans got very upset about that because Rian Johnson is a guy that a lot of Star Wars fans do not have any love for. I veer close to that particular camp in the sense that I think that it was a mistake to have Rian Johnson do a Star Wars movie. I think it was a mistake to have him direct The Last Jedi. I don't bear him any ill will. I've seen some of his other work. In particular, he did Knives Out. I actually saw in Edmonton this week, there's a bus shelter in Edmonton that still has the Knives Out promotional material there for some reason. That movie's like 2 years old now. Kind of an interesting aside. But, I don't bear Rian Johnson any ill will, but I don't think that he should have ever been involved in Star Wars. I don't think he had any real understanding of it. I don't get the sense that he had any real love for the franchise. I think that it was just something that he put on a resume for himself. But Dave Filoni credited Rian Johnson with helping him get into live action, which is actually a big part of the reason why we have The Mandalorian now. And a lot of fans absolutely lost their minds over it. And in a big sense, I don't really think that it was justified. When you actually read Dave Filoni's comments, what he literally talked about was that Rian Johnson took him aside and he gave him advice about technical matters that were related to filmmaking. And I think that in doing that, I think that Rian Johnson played a not dispensable role in The Mandalorian being as good as it is today. Now, a lot of that has to do with Jon Favreau, but Dave Filoni, he's a very active producer on this series, so he has a very big hand in that as well. So any help that Rian Johnson gave him reasonably helped the series. I don't think that should be a controversial thing to say. I don't think that it should be controversial for Dave Filoni to come out and say that.